I'm very pleased to be here. It's my first time in Finland, and believe me, I traveled a lot. But God knows why, because, you know, Finland is close. And I had many friends, even students from Finland, but I managed to be here. Unfortunately, I came here when I'm not 100%, but I'm sure that by tomorrow I'll recover and see your beautiful city. So thanks for inviting me. I think the main reason I'm here is not so much the fact that I'm a professor of economics in Siena. It is, of course, important, and economists, you know, take, how can I say, take a lot of attention these days, right? But it is also because of my role with the EU. And in fact, my research with the on pension has been carried out on the imports and has been funded primarily by the EU. In fact, the EU discovered the gender gap in pension, meaning the percentage difference, as you know, between men and women in pension income just a few years ago, with the first report we published in about 2013, right? And that actually followed a report that had been published in Germany and that caused uproar in Germany, where they discovered that the difference was above 40%, and that made news. And so the EU carried out and since then we've been working on that. That's to give you the background of the story of the research, so that you can place, you know, the scope and the limitation of what I've done. You can put it in place. Now, just a few things as I confessed, I didn't know Finland, and maybe some of you don't know Italy that well, or maybe they don't know Siena that well, which is the place where I come from. So the first thing I do is just to show a nice picture, because it is a nice town, right? So here it is. That's quite an impressive picture, of course, because not made by me. But it is this is one of the oldest medieval town in the whole of the world, I would say, one of the best preserved. And it has a huge, beautiful square where horse race is run every year. And the whole of the economy of the city runs around this horse race. As you can see here, I don't know how well you can see it, but there is the square filled, crowded with people, and the horses going around it, right? So it's quite an event. Now, coming to the less perhaps amusing, but equally fascinating things, my research on pension is of course carried out not alone, but with a team which you can find here. Some of the researchers belong to my university, others are mainly from Greece, and that is because Platontinius was the main expert when we started on pension, rather than gender, but on pension, when we started the research, and he had worked with the EU on such matters. Okay, enough for the background. Now let's go to the substance. So let's review a few basic concepts, which, however, may be useful when talking about such things. Why do income inequalities after retirement between men and women matter? Well, they matter because of gender equity. I don't need to comment about this in this audience. But I think one of the reasons why the topic has been discovered late, if you want, but is becoming prominent, is divorce. Is breaking down of family, is aging, of course, but is also divorce. As you all know, I don't know about Finland, but in many countries in the world, divorce rate has been picking up, especially among the 60-year plus. And that is something that is of concern, because if before you could say, well, differences, between pension income could be somehow equalized within a family, right? Now it's more difficult to say so. And therefore individual income matters. And of course, the issue is particularly relevant in countries, for example, in southern countries, although it is relevant even here, right? But in our part of the world, my part of the world, is even more relevant. And there are added reasons to that. Why does individual money, individual financial independence matters more now than in the past? Well, one of the reasons for those who may have any disability or illness or whatever is that, the supply of unpaid family care is shrinking, and not necessarily it is 100% compensated by state supplies. Again, this differs across countries, but it is, I would say, a common trend across countries as well, right? And the other reason that is less talked about, perhaps, is the fact that actually, before especially among economists, when you talked about the elderly, you talked about a population that had saved and could now deplete their saving with their consumption, but consumption was somehow low or lower than when you work, when you raise children, etc., but substantially lower. So it was really never thought that adequacy of income in old age matters so much. But there are many reasons why now consumption's levels may be rising. Well, first of all, if you have some disability, which is, of course, part of life, right, you may want to, or you may need to buy appliances, right, to counter that. And increasingly, they are the frontier of innovation. Increasingly, there are things that cost. Oh, but if you're healthy, you may simply need to keep yourself alive, healthy, and alert. And you may want to travel, go to museums, do nice things, or do interesting things, or keep yourself busy somehow. That costs money, right? More than it costed before, when old age was shorter and a completely different period from all perspectives, right? So for all these reasons, it is crucially important that women have got their own financial independence in old age. Having said what you may consider Lapalisian, meaning that, it's things known to everybody, but still worth rating, let's go to the technicalities now, right? What we mean by, and how we measure, what we mean by income inequalities after retirement and how we measure them. Well, there are two headline measures within the EU. One is the gender gap in coverage rate, meaning how many people are covered by some eligibility in pension, in any pension, right? And the gender gap is low, but in some countries it's worrying. It's about 5% for the whole of the EU. And another is the gender gap in pension income. And that, as you know, defined very simply, is the percentage difference between men and women in income derived from pension, right? That sounds simple to say, but there are, of course, details that one needs to cover to measure things accurately. And these are what age range do we take? Do we take pensioners aged 65 and over, or between 65 and 79. The EU is shifting between the 65 plus to the 65 and 79, between 65 and 79 age range, for a reason that we'll see in the next slide. And the reason is basically survivor pension. Survivor pension confuse very much or can be a confounding factor in how you measure the gender wage gap in income. And, of course, some countries are thinking of reforming it, but for whatever reason they make a huge difference. They accrue mostly to the over 75 years old, and that's why you take the other gap. Now, if you take the gap for the younger pensioners, the gap is actually larger, because survivor pension tend to compensate or reduce the overall gap, right? So if you take the, as I said, the age range 65 to 79, then you'll find yourself with a larger gap, but that's where the EU is going in the official measurement of the gap. Then you can take pensioners or the entire population over 65. That again makes a difference, of course. Normally, it is pensioners that are looked, that are considered. Okay. Then you can take median or mean value. Generally, median values are higher. The most commonly used is mean. As far as I am concerned, in the following presentation, I'll take the 65 years plus, the pension years only, and the mean values, okay? So most of the figures will refer to these. It's interesting to ask, what is the corresponding measure for inequality in earnings? Now, the previous presentation has given a measure which is differential in earnings for the people who work, right? So for men and women who work, you take what they take home at the end of the month and you calculate the difference, and that is roughly the equivalent and the mirror figure of the pension gap, if you want, while people work, right? However, that may be adequate for countries where most women work, right? It's inadequate for a lot of countries where a lot of women don't work, for the entire lifespan or for part of it. So in that case, there is another measure that is how would I say, more appropriate, right? And that is much more seldomly discussed, partly because it is so large in Europe, right? And the other measure is called Eurostat calls it the overall gender gap in earnings. How is it measured? You simply take men and women of working age, so like 1675, say conventionally, right? Whether they work or not, okay? Then you sum up all the earnings of the women, sum up all the earnings of the men, yeah, for the entire population, and then take the difference. Basically, you add to what was in the previous presentation the fact that the gender gap in earnings may be lower because a lot of women don't work, right? When they don't work, or where they don't work, right? Okay? And in fact, if you take this measure, well, we'll see the figures in a minute, okay? So it's important when you talk about inequalities in old age, and you try to understand them in the light of inequalities previously in the labor market, to sort of have these two mirror figures, because these two mirror figures take into account of all the factors that more or less should count. Okay? Now, let's get to the nitty-gritty here and see how the gender gap is, how large it is actually in Europe as a whole. Is it very large, and is it getting any smaller? If you take pensioners 65 plus, it is 36% in the whole of the EU. Okay? That's the gender gap in pension. Okay? It is even larger, as I mentioned, among younger pensioners, the latest figure, which is not comparable, was around 40%. It is roughly as large as the overall gender gap in earnings, the one I mentioned, right? And this one is around 37% for the whole of the EU, right? So as you can see, there is a correspondence, like in the case of Finland, between the gap in earnings and the gap in pension. Although there is no necessary reason why there should be a correspondence. But there is, because there are reasons why there should be a correspondence and reasons why the correspondence may be confounded by, for example, pension system factor. As a matter of fact, for the aggregate of the EU, there is correspondence. Now, the last thing I wanted to point out is that progress is mixed across the European Union. If you take the EU as a whole, the gender gap in pension has hardly moved in the last 10 years, right? But this not having moved comes from different pushes. In some countries it has moved, in some countries it has gone down, in some countries it has gone up, as it is usual with the EU. With 28 countries, you are always likely to have someone that goes up, someone that goes down, and then the average may be more or less stable, right? We'll see all that in figures. So, the gender gap in mean pension income, so my main indicator, okay? Pension is, as I said, over 65 plus. For those of you who care about the data, it is based on a particular data set, which is the SILK data. The measurement differ depending on what data set you use, as people who sort of crunch number know very well. Now, what is important is to compare the latest figure with the previous figure and see where the improvement has taken place and where it hasn't, okay? And here I have also a figure from Finland, all right, that may not coincide, however, with the figure that was given before because they refer to different data sets, of course. This is a EU data set, and it is a survey. Yours, I guess, it's administrative data, right? So normally you would expect a difference, right? But it's not a large difference in the case of Finland. So there is quite similarity. So the 2006 figures, as you can see, is, as I said, about 36% for the EU. Okay, here is Finland, and you can draw your conclusion. I mean, it's higher than yours, but not that much higher, right? Considering the difference in data source, it's not to worry, right? So these are the figures for 2016. Let's look at the figures 10 years earlier. As you can see, in the majority of countries, right, the dots are the 10 years earlier. The dots are lower than the bars in the majority of countries, right? That means a decrease has taken place, okay? So in the majority of countries. But if you look at the EU, the end of the bar coincides with the dot. So more or less, we are stable there after 10 years, right? And that's all you need to consider. In Finland also, here there is a slight decrease, right? But it is the two figures are very close, which coincide with what comes out from administrative data. So that means that the data that the EU uses are fairly online with what country data may suggest, okay? At least in the case of Finland. Okay, so progress has been there for some countries, and of course for some countries it's very large, but overall progress is nil or very slow, which is worrying. Now, here are the reasons why I told you earlier that sometimes the younger pensioners are targeted for measurement rather than older pensioners. And this is a different data source, so you can't really compare figures. But what the figure will do is to compare the gap in all types of pensions for men and women with the gap in own right pension. Own right pension means that if I am a woman and I have a pension, I don't have it by right of having been married to somebody and having the survivor pension, right? Basically, from a practical point of view, you are excluding survivor pension, right? And here are the figures. Now, this is all pensions for a number of countries. Finland is not included because we didn't have the data. And this is the gap in own right pension. As you can see, the bar from own right pension, the orange bar, is mostly above, well, the orange, how could I say, dash, right? So this line, I'll come back. Okay, I'll come back. Here is the gap in all pension, right? And now look at what the gap does in own right pension. Oh, wrong bar. Again. There. It is mostly above, which means that survivor pension tends to, in most countries, enlarge the survivor pension tends to dampen the gender gap, right? We'll come back to survivor pension in terms of conclusion, because after this evidence, for example, at EU headquarters, before there was a strong emphasis on getting rid of survivor pension, right? With the argument that, it could be an inactivity trap, women would not be willing to work because, in any case, even in old age, they could inherit what their husband did, so they did the utmost for the husband to have a nice career and so on, in some countries, of course. Let's call it an activity trap, so that should go if women need to be fully emancipated and so on and so forth. And individual decisions should be individual and not family-based, whatever. These were the arguments. But after this evidence, the fervor of the EU in favor of abolishing survivor pension has dampened. Now they are much more cautious on the argument. And we'll see some case like the one, the recent reform that was done in Belgium, for example, where they've done so. They have not measured the impact yet, but the expectation is that the gender gap in pension will rise as a result of replacing the survivor pension with something else, with a transitional benefit. Okay, so we have talked so far of the extent of the gap in pension across Europe. Now I will try to identify some factors that contribute to explaining it. Okay? Now, it's difficult to do so. Why? Because it's easy to have an idea that, well, of course, women work less, and therefore, if the pension is based on years of contribution, they'll have less pension, and so on and so forth, right? It's easy. It's not easy to put data on that, because you need longitudinal data. At the EU level, there are very few sources. And in fact, there is just one source now that has appeared like 1 year, 2 years ago. It's called SHARE. Many of you know it, I guess. It concerned a few countries, not all. Well, it has been increased to most countries now, but before it was a limited number of EU countries, right? And it has released something called Share Life, where it is retrospective. You ask people what they earned when they were 20, they were 30, blah, blah, blah. Based on the source, I and my team have done, upon the request of the EU, a preliminary attempt to understand how the choices about working and other choices in the life of the current pensioners contribute to explain the gender gap for current pensioners, right? It is, however, a very preliminary attempt, and as usual, the result of these exercises are fascinating from some point of view, at least for scholars, and how do you say, they can be disappointing from other point of view. In particular, in our exercise, with the kind of factors that you will see identified in the next slide, we could only explain 18% of the gap, so less than 20%. However, economists would tell you that this is quite an achievement, because when you try to do these things for earnings and try to understand what contributes to differences in earnings, you normally come up with an explanation for 10%. So 18% is a good figure. No matter what, but I mean, for, non-economists, okay, obviously it tells you that you should be cautious when you interpret the result of this, right? Now, what are the results? Here are the results, and they are not. Now, look first at the list of factors that we have taken into consideration to explain the gap. And these are listed over here. They are years in retirement, whether you're married or not, years in employment, of course, the sector of work, public sector versus self-employment, or at a certain point there is agriculture right here, okay. Years in part-time employment, but here, mind you, it is only years in part-time employment, not how severe part-time employment is, meaning, are you a light part-timer or a heavy part-timer, right? How many hours you work, basically. So it is an imperfect measurement of part-time. And then these are the factors that you can see. I need to put my glasses on sometime, and in this case I do. Whether you had children, whether you had a private employees. And another factor that I didn't talk about so far was the pillars, meaning, I have to comment on that briefly, whether for the single person that was used, for each single person that was used to make this calculation, whether this person received not only Pillar 1 pension, meaning basically state pension, but the person also received occupational pension, or the person had a private scheme towards a pension, so contributed with her or his own money towards a pension, right? Now, occupational pension and private scheme are part of the so-called second and third pillar in pension system, right? So what we took into account is how much the second and third pillar weigh on each individual person package, okay? And we will see that the results are quite extraordinary, okay? That's why I went for this comment. I wasted some minutes for that, okay? Now, what you can see here, I better go back. Here, at every click of the mouse, you will see for each country a little bar that shows you the weight of that particular factor. Please read the factors along this line. So, well, okay, I'll comment them. It's easy. This is not an easy graph to comment. There we go. This is years in retirement. As you can see, they don't explain very much. They explain a little bit. Let's go to the next. Marital status, explain a little more. The amount of things that are explained depend on country, but more or less you can, have an overall impression by judging at the size of the rectangular of the bar. Okay? Then here we have this is marital status again. This should be children. Now, you may wonder why children matter so little, right? Children matter little because most pension income have factors to counteract with children, right? Or, and that is one explanation, the other explanation is if you have children, you normally work part-time, you normally work fewer years, so the effect of children is captured by the other variables, okay? I hope I made myself clear. And that explains why children on their own, independently, explain so little, right? Then what we have here is one of the big factors. What is it? I put figures on that. And you can see that this is years in employment, right? So years in employment is the main chunk in this exercise, right? Now let's go briefly over the others. You can read it yourself now. What has appeared is I believe the public employee versus self-employee, meaning the sector where you work. Of course, if you are a public employee, you are more likely to have had a nicer pension in many countries as compared to private employees, right? But now I lead you quickly through other things. There is also part-time, sorry. Let me comment part-time. Part-time is the green, right? Sorry. The green. As you can see, years in part-time count enough, okay? The squares are large enough, although part-time is underestimated as a factor because you only count how many years in part-time you've been in your working life. And now a bit of the surprise of this calculation is that. Now you can see that let's take the Netherlands, right? You can see that a huge chunk is explained by what? Is explained by second and third pillar pension, right? Now that is important. Why? Because another of the thrust in the EU was, in order to ensure sustainability of pension system, we should turn increasingly to non-first pillar pension. I don't say occupational pension, but at least private scheme, right? Now, the problem is that all these schemes contribute a great deal to increase the gender gap for obvious reasons. Women earn less or are in less well-paid occupation. And when earnings are your target, when you sort of make the link between pension and earnings closer, then you increase the gap, right? So the reason is simple. Now, why it happened for some countries and not others is, again, very simple. The second and third pillar pension are present, they are mature, they've been operating enough, they are important enough only in a few countries in Europe. Netherlands is one of them. But the important lesson that comes from that is monitor, beware of an excessive use of second and third pillar pension in order to solve the problem. Okay? I've already anticipated what I'm going to, 5 minutes, my God. Now, I wanted to, I briefly, and I stress briefly, go over what will count in the future. We have seen what counted in the past, summarily, and now what will count in the future? Well, educational attainment and disciplinary choices will count less. Okay? I won't elaborate on that because there isn't much time. Years in employment will count less. And I'll show you why. That I'll spend just a little time, because it is important. Years in employment, you have seen it was the black bar in the previous slide. It was one of the factors that contributed to explaining the pension. Why will they count less? Let's look at this figure. Mean years in employment of age group, right? And here you have, these are for the EU as a whole. Here you have several age groups. The younger until the older workers, right? Now, let's look at this figure. What does it tell you? That the mean years in employment for a man rise, obviously, it's natural, alongside the working career. And of course, reaches the maximum, which is about 37 years, at 55 to 64 years old. Now, this figure is for men at 2005, right? Now, the next figure will be, for men in 2015. In 10 years, hardly any difference. If anything, average years in employment for men are falling. Now, look at women. This is the 2005 line, and this is the 2015 line. You can see the difference in older ages. What has happened? Women are catching up in their older years. Why? Well, because in their older years, they are no longer lumbered by family responsibilities, right? And they are starting working more. Partly they are pushed into working more by the pension reform, who have extended pensionable age. Whatever the reason may be, women are catching up at older ages, which means, by and large, with all the correction that you may have in mind, extending the pensionable age goes in the right direction. Okay? I'm being brutal because I don't have much time, of course, here. Okay? Then, I'm not sure, the visualization of these slides is a bit odd, and I can see that you don't visualize as I did do in my computer, or I did in my computer, but that's it. Anyway, things that, these are factors that will continue to matter. These are survivor pension, we have seen why. Non-public pension, meaning pension of second and third pillar, and we have seen why. If there is a policy to push the pension system towards a second and a third pillar, that will continue to increase the gender gap. And, hours of work will continue to matter. Now, we have seen in the previous slide years of employment. Now, I'll simply tell you the next slide, and I'll tell you the story, and the story is simple. Whereas women are catching up quite visibly in terms of years in employment, they are not catching up in terms of hours worked as fast. Why? They work longer years, but the share of part-time or shorter time work in the EU as a whole is not decreasing. If anything, it is increasing slightly. Okay? So this factor will continue to matter. Then, what are the factors that may matter more in the future? Okay? These are related to the so-called new forms of work and the so-called gig employment. In both cases, you have a problem, which is the one that the EU is trying to tackle just now, which is dwindling access to social security. Meaning, if you take, for example, many platform workers, they don't pay contribution, or their employer may not fully pay contribution. If you take bogus self-employment, same story, right? And these areas of work are expanding now. How will they influence the gender gap? Well, of course, the answer depends on whether they are expanding more for men or for women. The problem is that we don't know the answer yet, but it is a possible threat that comes from there, right? So I can skip all that because I don't have time, don't worry. So in terms of policy, I think that I've told you already what a major problem may be. There was something else I was going to discuss, but we can leave the discussion on policy for the question time, right? If there is question time. Here I had in the last slide some nice examples, and one example I want to simply talk about, because I don't have time to go through in the slide, is Spain. Because they claim it is reducing the gender gap drastically. The example is what they call complemento de maternidade. And it works as follows. For every child, depending on the number of child, or for every additional child, you get a percentage increase in your pension. Full stop. Simple rule. This goes on top of the notional credit that you get for years out of employment because of childcare. Now, apparently, this sort of, if you want, very simple mechanism tied to the number of children is reducing the gender gap in pension in Spain pretty fast. But to be honest, I haven't looked at the figures. They were reported to me by the Spanish expert in my EU team, so it is provisional. Now, with this nice example and a hopeful example, I leave you there. Thank you very much for paying attention to a complicated and long discussion. Oh.
Thank you, Francesca, for a very interesting presentation and giving us a good overview of why this matters, how to measure it, and how to perhaps tackle the issue. We are running a bit late, so we will take 1 or 2 or 3 questions. So now I open the floor for the questions. Yeah, you stay there. And I ask you to tell your name and where you come from, and we have 2 microphones going around the room. So, time for questions and comments. Okay, over there.
Thank you. It's on? Thank you. Hi, my name is Christopher Lundberg. I work at the Swedish Ministry of Health and Social Affairs. I would like to come back to the issue of survivors' pensions. One of the main features of, say, the Swedish and the Nordic model is to prevent power imbalances within the workplace, between the partners, and also in the families. And women have made a large sort of gain in gender equality due to the fact that they are now economically independent of other family members, such as their husbands. This enables them to sort of divorce and leave their families whenever they want to and choose to, and has a lot of sort of well, basically it increases the well-being of women, that they are that they are able to leave their husbands if they are beaten, if they are, having a tough time. And survivors' pension sort of puts this discussion a little bit backwards, if you ask me. I mean, divorce rates are high. They will continue to be high, most likely. They are currently about 50%. And the solution that you aim for is sort of going into another direction than the direction that we in the Nordic countries have been persuading since the late 1960s. So I'd like to sort of see the logic in strengthening the role of women and advancing gender equality, whilst at the same time persuading a formula that, according to me, and probably many others from the North, moves in the wrong direction. Thank you.
I'm Anna Rucik from the Finnish Family Federation. This is a comment on the divorce rates. Actually, the divorce rates so far in the older population in Finland have relatively little effect. I mean, the great difference is due to widowhood. So they are rising everywhere, but still they used to be so low. And this goes to your comment also, that most elderly women would be without a spouse because the man has died, whereas actually the highest likelihood of being married at any point in life is when a Finnish man is 76 years old.
Thank you for that new, interesting, picky information, Anna.
Yeah, thank you. I found this very interesting when you showed that for some countries, actually the younger retired women have a higher gender gap. Especially in southern countries like Malta, the gap or the difference between the cohorts was very pronounced. Do you have some explanation for this? Especially if you don't have background knowledge on Malta, you can just say, no, I don't have background knowledge. But I would be really interested why this changed and whether they have some kind of reverse development going on in terms of gender equality. Thank you.
Thank you. Shortly, yeah, we will stop here if you could reply.
Malta is the shortest. I told you to be careful. I mean, obviously, thank you. That's much helpful. I told you to be careful with the figures because they are based on survey figures and we have no alternative at the moment. You can't compare administrative data across countries, right? Malta is a very small country. That means that in a survey, it gets very few observations. So the likelihood that, of course, all this, our statisticians are brilliant, but, one should first caution the figure. Having said that, no, I don't have any specific information of why, in the case of Malta, it is so much larger, but I would guess it is so much larger because of survivor pension. And that makes sense because in Malta, the participation rate was something like 30% until a few years ago. So, yeah, obviously survivors make up, and that's it. So there is no recent thing. It is the past. Okay? So that is Malta. Now, divorce rate and widowhood. Again, even the second question points again to the importance, once more, of survivor pension versus the rest, because that is, what being widowed meant. It doesn't simply imply that, but I mean, if you're a widow, at least in my country, and your husband had a higher pension, then you have an option of whether retaining yours or getting the one of your husband may be decreased by a certain amount, of course within limitation, but again the issue of survivor pension comes back in a different way. So let me go to this, and also concerning the divorce rate, it depends on country. Here, probably it is stable. Again, if you take southern countries where divorce was relatively uncommon, the rise in divorce is across our age range. But the new thing, because before you simply didn't think of it, is that, couples 60 plus divorce. Now, this, as far as I know, has been talked about a lot also in the USA. So it isn't simply a southern country phenomenon. It is a worldwide phenomenon. We are, for reasons that do not need comment. So again, it depends on countries. The issue of the divorce rate may be of varying importance. So let me go back to the issue of survivor pension. And if I'm allowed, let me make a parallel, again with divorce. And from my own country, which I know best for obvious reason. There was a recent court sentence in my country saying that women who divorce are, of course, entitled to compensation from their husband. Now I forgot the name. To alimony, right? But alimony before, by law, was to be set at a level that allowed the woman to continue after divorce, often with the kids to, take care of, because the kids were often entrusted to her, at the same standard of living as before the marriage, right? Now, a recent court upheld this judgment. It was actually a woman, and said, this is not modern, inverted comma, right? Because this reflects the past. And we should take away the sentence that was favorable to women, because, obviously the judge had to make sure that the alimony reflected past living standard, and having something that is, let's say, less generous. I'm not interested in the legal detail. I'm interested in the debate that followed. Because even feminists divided pro and against. Because it's true. We are not, the new sentence is forward-looking. We want women to be more independent, and we don't want to always protect them, right? Like with survivor pension. But on the other hand, equality is not there yet. There is a still huge imbalance in unpaid work. What do we do with it? Do we ignore it altogether because we want to get to full emancipation quickly? I think we might ignore it, but then I think that discussing about what you put in place, meaning the transitional benefit, and, really thinking through the clauses of that transitional benefit is essential. So in a way, if you really ask my guts, I would say, I don't like survivor pension, but I want to see what is put in its place before saying, I like the change. That's all, which is very common sense. Don't need an economist for that.